Over the past 20 years, the U.S. has been active in the Middle East. Some point to the region's vast oil resources as the prime motivation for this American presence, as a quarter of the world's known petroleum reserves are in Saudi Arabia. Further escalating this competition are calls from energy experts, predicting that oil reserves are running low, sending many countries scrambling for resources and focusing foreign relations initiatives on its discovery and use. Developed nations are the heaviest consumers, and thus are the most vulnerable to petroleum shortages. An example of the tension caused by oil is the rocky relations between Central European nations, such as Belarus, Poland, and Germany, which rely on pipelines from Russia. As the greatest consumer of oil worldwide, the U.S. will be a central actor on this issue as it comes to fruition. Michael Klare is highly regarded as an analyst of contemporary resource wars, and he has written widely on U.S. defense policy, the arms trade, and world security issues. He is director and professor in the 5 Colleges program in Peace and World Security Studies at Amherst, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and Smith Colleges, and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He has also served as director of the program on militarism and disarmament at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Klare is the author of Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws and Resource Wars, The New Landscape of Global Conflict. His newest book is Blood and Oil, The Dangers and Consequences of America's Growing Dependency on Imported Petroleum. Klare has contributed articles to Foreign Affairs, The Nation, Arms Control Today, and Harper's, among others. He is defense correspondent for The Nation and a contributing editor of Current History. Klare serves on the board of the Arms Control Association and the National Priorities Project, and is on the advisory board of the Arms Division of Human Rights Watch. Before we begin, I would like to ask that the sound be disabled on any cell phones and pagers. Participation is encouraged, but please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, when there will be a short question and answer session. Because today's event is being recorded, and out of courtesy to those who may be hearing impaired, please raise your hand to alert us and wait for a microphone to reach you before speaking. And now, please join me in welcoming Michael Klare.
Thank you, everyone. I have to turn this on. Yes. Hello, everyone. I hope we have more than a short time for questions and discussion, because that's the most fun part. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so many people for coming out. I hope what I have to say is of interest and worthy of you coming to hear me speak. In my view, we're meeting tonight at an absolute pivotal, tumultuous time in American history. Why is that so? Well, first of all, as you well know, the United States is bogged down in what seems to me to be an unwinnable war in Iraq. And even if the United States succeeds in extricating itself from this war without permanent damage to its interests in the Middle East, we're certainly going to come out of it with our Treasury $1 trillion poorer. And it's unclear how that $1 trillion is ever going to be paid back. And our military is going to be severely damaged by what happens in Iraq. It also appears that we're on the verge of escalating that war with strikes on Iran, and I hope you'll ask me about this later. I believe that the likelihood of attacks on Iran are greater than 50%, probably closer to 75%, and the consequences of this are unforeseeable, but likely catastrophic, but we're certainly moving in that direction. We're also at a time of what I would call the beginning of a permanent energy crisis, in which energy will be increasingly scarce, expensive, constant disruptions, and a mismatch between the energy supplies that we have and the kind of energy that will spare us from permanent damage to the climate. So these are the kind of surface headline characteristics of the moment with which you're all familiar. What I want to talk about is what is behind these headline events, these surface conditions with which you're familiar. What are the underlying forces that bring us to this predicament. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'm going to talk about 5 basic underlying factors that I think underlie the situation that we're in today, and hopefully get to some thoughts about how to extricate ourselves from this dilemma. So the first of these 5 factors is our absolute dependence on one particular form of energy, petroleum. Petroleum is the major source of energy in the United States and in the world. Petroleum supplies 40% of our energy in this country and 40% of the world's energy supply. And you have to grasp its significance to our net supply. Compare the next 2 major sources of energy are coal and natural gas, which are each about 23–24%, whereas petroleum is 40%. All other sources of energy are much smaller, much less than 10%. Nuclear, hydropower, renewables, under 10% each. All of them insignificant compared to petroleum. What's remarkable is that despite all the talk of alternatives, of renewables, of emphasis on spending and investment and research on energy alternatives, the Department of Energy predicts that by 2025, 2030, petroleum will still supply 40% of our energy, and renewables and all of the rest will still supply less than 10% of our energy supply. Coal and natural gas will each supply about 24–25%. So the prediction is that we will still be dependent on petroleum for 2/5 of our energy in 2025. But that's just in the gross terms. The main reason why petroleum is so important, of course, is its pivotal role in transportation and warfare. Virtually every car, truck, SUV, van, bus, plane, train, bomber, helicopter, Humvee, missile, war machine of transportation is powered by petroleum and its derivatives. 98% of all transportation energy comes from petroleum. The globalized world's economy runs on petroleum. American suburban life and commerce is totally dependent on petroleum. American military power is absolutely dependent on petroleum and would vanish in an instant without an abundant supply of petroleum. That's why petroleum is so central to our way of life. And there's something else you need to know about oil in this regard. There are no substitutes out there on the horizon that will be available on any substantial scale in the immediate or foreseeable future. Yes, ethanol can provide a certain supplement for a certain amount. If we, for example, turn every cornfield in America over to corn, over to production of corn for the use in making ethanol, it can substitute for 10% of our petroleum consumption, 1/10 of our petroleum consumption, if we use all the cornfields in America for this purpose. Of course, we'll go hungry in the process. And then what about the other 90% of our petroleum? Where's that going to come from? So, and that's just 10% of our petroleum if we decide to go hungry. And yes, there's talk of converting other biomass materials into liquid, so-called cellulosic ethanol you may have heard of. And there's some promise in this technology in the laboratory. But the Department of Energy is saying that the first pilot plant to convert cellulosic ethanol using processes that haven't yet been fully tested will be ready in 2012, and that's a pilot plant. There are no plans for an industrial-scale cellulosic ethanol plant on the horizon at this point, let alone a capacity to replace any petroleum. And there's talk of, you probably are aware of, hydrogen and other coal to liquids. These have been tested in laboratories, and some money is being put to use to develop them. But basically, there are no substitutes for petroleum for liquid purposes out there on the horizon to replace it. So we are dependent on this substance for our transportation and for making war, and there are no substitutes on the horizon. That's my first point. Second point, we're running out of petroleum. Some of you may be familiar with this literature. Petroleum is a finite substance. Mother Nature created a certain amount of it in her good graces for our benefit. Hundreds of millions of years this took. We've been using it only for the past 145 years when we began tapping into it in the first great oil kingdom. How many of you know what was the first great oil sheikdom? The great oil sheikdom of Pennsylvania. You all know this, I hope. 145 years ago. At that time, it was estimated that the Earth possessed about 2 trillion barrels, a nice, easy, round number to remember, 2 trillion barrels of conventional liquid petroleum. We've used approximately half of that amount. So the good news is that there are approximately 1 trillion barrels of petroleum left. And at current rates of usage, we keep increasing the level of usage. It took 145 years or so to use up the first trillion barrels, but we're using it up so rapidly now that there's enough left for maybe 30 or 40 years at the current level of usage. That is, if China stops growing and India stops growing and we stop growing, it'll last 30 to 40 years, 35 years or so. Of course, if we continue to expand at the rates we are, it'll last another 25 years. But that's the good news. The bad news is the first trillion barrels that came out of the ground in Pennsylvania and Oklahoma and Texas and places like that was the easy to get oil, the stuff that's close to the surface. The first drill in Titusville, Pennsylvania struck oil, I think if I remember correctly, was 20 feet from the surface. It was almost right there. In Oklahoma, they just had to put a stick in the ground and it comes spurting out in Texas and Oklahoma. So the first trillion barrels was close to the surface, or if it was offshore, it was close inshore, right off of New Orleans and places like that, in big, giant reservoirs that were easy to get to. It was in friendly countries like the US of A and Canada. It was under a lot of pressure. It was easy to get to oil. That's all gone. We've used it all. It's vanished. We'll never see it again. What's left is the hard-to-get-at oil, deep underground, far offshore, in smaller pockets, in unfriendly countries, in dangerous countries, countries that hate us or that are corrupt or unstable or at war. For example, where America still has a lot of oil, where is our oil? It's either in Alaska in the North Slope, which is it's environmentally fragile, and we risk destroying our last pristine wilderness, and even getting it, assuming we choose to destroy our last remaining wilderness areas. Just getting it here is problematical and risky. The other place where the Department of Energy wants us to drill for oil is in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Where exactly? Put in your minds the track of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Dennis, and the other worst hurricanes of the past 25 years, where they intersect. That's where the most promising remaining oil left in the United States is. That's not an accident, because we've used up all the easy stuff. What's left is the hard stuff, the dangerous stuff, the environmentally dangerous stuff. And it's the same worldwide. The remaining oil is in the Arctic. It's off Sakhalin Island in Russia. It's in deepest parts of Africa. It's in war-torn areas of Nigeria. It's in Iraq. It's in Iran. It's in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Corrupt, dangerous, hostile places. All of them. So even though there is oil left, but getting it is going to be increasingly costly, risky, hazardous, dangerous. And the likelihood of getting it in the quantities we need is going to be increasingly diminished. So even if we don't run out of it, it will be constantly, there'll be constant shocks, shortages, crises. This is the new normality. We're never going to go back to the period when oil was abundant and easy to get. This leads to my next point, my third point. I don't think I have to belabor it. We're not the only country that's in this predicament, but we face intense competition from other countries, especially China. I'm sure you're well aware of that. They're in the same predicament as us. But also, coming on the heels of China will come India, and then Brazil, and other rising powers of the developing world. I mean, just to give you a scale of magnitude of this, in 1990, not all that long ago, 17 years ago, China consumed only 2.3 million barrels of oil a day. And in 1990, we in this country consumed 17 million barrels of oil a day. You get the ratio, 2.3 to 17 million barrels a day. And at that time, China produced 3 million barrels a day, so it had zero impact on the world oil flow. And that 2.3 million barrels of oil a day was only 4% of world oil consumption, meaningless amount. By 2030, according to the Department of Energy, China will consume 15 million barrels of oil a day, making it the world's second largest consumer. And that'll be 13% of world consumption at that time, from 4% to 13% in that period. And it will still only produce about 3 million barrels a day domestically, so it'll have to import about 11 or 12 million barrels a day, making it the world's second biggest importer as well as consumer of oil after the United States, which at that time will consume 28 million barrels a day supposedly, and will have to import 17 million barrels a day, just to give you a sense of these numbers. Together, the two countries, China and the United States, will have to import 28 million barrels of oil a day. That's an awful lot of oil in 2030. This is at a time in 2030 when I expect the world supply of oil will be less than it is today. Less than it is today. Where is that 28 million barrels of oil going to come from? Where are they going to get it from? Well, the fact is there are only about this many countries left in the world that have a surplus of oil, this many, that could supply the U.S. and China with this 28 million barrels a day. And they're fewer and fewer in number. And there are only a few places left in the world. They're in the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, or in Africa, Angola, Nigeria, and Sudan, or in the former Soviet Union, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Russia, and Venezuela, Colombia maybe. That's about it. There aren't any other countries with a surplus of oil to supply. And I believe you can write the history of world affairs on the basis of that list, because the U.S. and China and Japan and the other countries will have no choice but to go to those countries. Now, I'll repeat them: Angola, Nigeria, Sudan, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Venezuela, Colombia. What do you know about these countries? They're either engaged in warfare, civil war, or ethnic conflict, or they're deeply corrupt, or they're ruled by dictators, or they are divided along ethnic and religious lines, or they're deeply hostile to the United States. 3/4 of them have Muslim majority population or a significant Muslim population, or they are ruled by rulers who are hostile to the United States. This is what our lifestyle has become dependent upon. Bear in mind, the American way of life is dependent on this list of countries. American warfare, American military power rests on the surplus produced by these countries. But so too is China's and India's and the others. So like I say, I believed that the foreign policy and the military policy of the United States and China and Japan and India and Europe increasingly will be governed by the absolute necessity of securing increasing quantities of petroleum from that 10 or 12 countries in order to keep their economy and their military power robust in the years ahead. By the way, the one exception to this list of dependent countries is Russia, and therein lies another story that we could come back to. Russia is the only great power that itself has a surplus of energy that's not dependent on imports, but is actually exports oil. And Russian leaders, led by Vladimir Putin, has come to understand that in a world of the future in which I've described, the world will be divided into two classes of countries: energy haves and energy have-nots. And the energy have-nots will be dependent and will be forced to grovel before the energy have powers and do their bidding increasingly, or to fight. And I'll come to that in a minute. And Vladimir Putin has determined to use Russia's energy surplus as the vehicle to restore, to rebuild Russia's status as a superpower. What nuclear weapons was to the Cold War and to the 20th century, energy will be the source of power for Russia in the 21st century. So Russia is using its surplus of oil and natural gas to become an energy superpower, and using this in a very coercive way with its neighbors and to dominate Europe as well. And we've seen this exercised in a very calculated and brutal fashion in the past year. This is the new politics, the new global politics of the 21st century. And now I come to my fourth point, that in response to these developments, the United States especially, but some of the other countries, including China, are increasingly relying on military means to address the predicament in which we find ourselves, to rely on military power to ensure access to these dangerous foreign suppliers, sources of oil, and to ensure the safe delivery of petroleum that we need to our own territory and to our overseas military combatants. And this has become a consensus in Washington. I call it the new Washington consensus. Its reliance on military power to satisfy our energy needs. Now, this is not a new consensus. It really began with the Carter administration in January 1980, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Islamic Revolution in Iran. President Carter and his associates, this was a Democratic administration, feared that those events would threaten the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to the United States and to its allies. And in his State of the Union address on January 23, 1980, President Carter said to the assembled members of Congress that the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to the United States and the rest of the world was a vital interest of the United States. It was essential to our national security, and therefore the United States would use any means necessary to protect that flow, including the use of military force. And that was the first time in which the President of the United States said in such a public fashion explicitly that the protection of oil, A, was a national security matter, a vital interest of the United States, and to protect that interest, we will use military force as necessary. Now, at that time, the United States did not possess a military capacity in the Persian Gulf to actually implement the Carter Doctrine. That was called the Carter Doctrine, to implement this policy. So President Carter created a new military force, which he called the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, the RDJTF, a sort of ad hoc military organization made up a ragtag army, as it were, that could be airlifted as necessary into that region. He also created a permanent military flotilla in the Persian Gulf and acquired new bases in that area. Then, in 1983, President Reagan elevated that force, the RDJTF, into what's called a Central Command. Central because it was sort of in Central Asia, central between the European Command, which had command over Europe and Africa at that time, and the Pacific Command, which had command obviously in Pacific and Asia. These are the regional commands that command all U.S. forces in these regions. So the Central Command was established explicitly for the purpose of protecting the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to the United States. So when people say to me or to you or anyone that the protection of oil, that's not what we do, that's not what our forces are for, tell them to read the history and the charter of the Central Command. You understand that the Central Command is what is fighting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. When you hear it was General Abizaid until recently, who's the commander-in-chief of the Central Command. Now it's Admiral William Fallon. I'll come back to that later. Why Admiral Fallon is commanding U.S. ground troops in Iraq. It's the commander of the Central Command who is fighting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, the purpose of this command was established to implement the Carter Doctrine, which was explicitly, publicly, to protect the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. So, in essence, the Carter Doctrine says that the United States will not allow any hostile power to threaten the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, and the U.S. will use force whenever such a threat arises. This was the rationale given by President Bush Sr. to the American public on August 8th, 1990. Some people in this room may remember his televised speech when Iraqi forces occupied Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, threatening the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. And he said that this poses a vital threat to America's oil interests in Saudi Arabia, and we cannot allow this to happen, and I am sending troops to Saudi Arabia to protect the oil fields he used the O word, oil fields, and to drive the Iraqis out. This was then the rationale given for the quarantine of Iraq when President Bush Sr. decided not to invade Baghdad in 1991 at the end of Operation Desert Storm, but to bring down the Saddam Hussein regime through a quarantine, which lasted from 1991 to 2003. And President Clinton carried that out as well. And he said explicitly the purpose of the quarantine and the sanctions was regime change. This was not a recent term, but President Clinton used that. As you know, this strategy failed. It made Saddam Hussein stronger. So when Bush Jr. entered the White House in 2001, his cabinet debated what to do about the failure of the sanctions policy. It was not achieving its intended result of bringing down Saddam Hussein. But it was very clear that the strategy from the very beginning was to carry out the intended effect of the First Persian Gulf War, which, as President Bush Sr., his father, said was to carry out the impulse of the Carter Doctrine, which was to eliminate a threat to American dominance of the Persian Gulf and its oil fields. And the cabinet was debating this up until September 11th, 2001, and in the aftermath of that event, President Bush decided no more bickering. We're going to eliminate this problem once and for all with an invasion of Iraq. And I'm absolutely convinced that this was a continuation of the war begun by his father. But the record, I believe, is absolutely clear that this is one long, continuous struggle that began on August 2nd, 1990. And Vice President Dick Cheney, in his speech on August 25th, 2002, before the Veterans and Foreign War, said explicitly that we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein because if he isn't stopped, he'll dominate the entire Persian Gulf and use that power to shut off the oil flow to the rest of the world. We cannot permit this. In other words, a restatement of the Carter Doctrine. And that, I believe, is why we're fighting a war in Iraq. Now, American strategists see yet another threat to the Persian Gulf, Iran. And I'm not going to go on at length about this. We'll have time. You can ask me more about this. Once again, there's talk of weapons of mass destruction, as there was in 2003, but I will argue that just as in 2003, weapons of mass destruction is the surface explanation for why we went after Iraq then and why we're going after Iran now. This is yet again another articulation of the underlying Carter Doctrine that Iran poses a threat to American dominance of the Persian Gulf and its oil, and in line with the Carter Doctrine, that threat has to be eliminated as well. And by the way, I said earlier, why pick Admiral Fallon to be Commander-in-Chief of the Central Command? Maybe this is a little bit of a digression. Admiral Fallon is a commander of aircraft carrier battle groups. You do not pick a commander of aircraft carrier battle groups to command ground forces in Iraq and Afghanistan unless you expect the next phase of the war to involve aircraft carrier battle operations. And the only conceivable situation in which you will do that is when you're sending more aircraft carrier battle groups to the Persian Gulf for use in battle operations, which is what President Bush announced on January 10th that he was doing, and the only and in the context of stepping up military pressure on Iran. So I think this is another indication that Iran is the next target. But let me continue. As I said, the Carter Doctrine was explicitly applied to the Persian Gulf region. It says that the oil flow from the Persian Gulf is essential to American security. We'll do whatever it takes to preserve that flow. We'll eliminate any rival, any hostile threat by military means as necessary. As the United States has become more dependent on oil from other parts of the world, from other unstable regions of the world, the Carter Doctrine is being expanded, extended to these other areas. You could call it the globalization of the Carter Doctrine, especially to the Caspian Sea area and to Africa. And I won't go into the same kind of detail, but I'm happy to answer questions about this. This process began in the Clinton administration. And by the way, I want to try to show that this history is not a Republican policy. It's not a Bush Jr. policy. This is a bipartisan policy. It began with a Democratic administration, Carter. It was continued by Bush Sr., then another Democratic administration, the Clinton administration. There's a continuity to this. So it was President Clinton who favored growing U.S. reliance on Caspian Sea oil, who went out of his way to promote the BTC pipeline, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which opened up this summer, carrying Caspian Sea oil through Baku in Azerbaijan, through Georgia, to Turkey. And because of this is a pipeline that passes through 7 war zones, including Chechnya, South Ossetia, where the terrible terrorist activities occurred, Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, and who therefore has favored U.S. military support for the governments in the area, and who announced that the flow of oil from the Caspian Sea, from the Caspian Sea is vital to American national security, in the same kind of language that Carter used with the Persian Gulf, and who therefore was the first president to favor military aid to the former Soviet republics of the Caspian Sea area. President Bush has vastly increased this aid and has given it a veneer of anti-terrorism. But if you look at the justifications given to Congress for military aid to Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all of these countries, yes, it says terrorism, but what the money is going for is to protect pipelines, oil platforms, other oil infrastructure. That's why the U.S. is so deeply invested in that area, and it's just like the Carter Doctrine. Same thing is happening in Africa. We're becoming increasingly dependent on African oil. And as a result, the U.S. is building up its military presence and military aid to African countries. Just to give you an example of how significant and how rapidly this is happening, because I love the history of this, how recently this is. I told you that in 1983, President Reagan created the Central Command to protect Persian Gulf oil. That was the last time the U.S. created a new regional command. These regional commands are like Rome, ancient Rome. You know, they created these vast areas where the Roman legions were the most powerful force. These commanders are like America's proconsuls. When was the last time that America created a regional command? Was 1983 until February 2007. 2 weeks ago, the Department of Defense created an Africa Command. The Africa Command. Why? Because we're becoming dependent on African oil, and they're worried about the safety of African oil. Yes, terrorism too, but they're worried about Nigeria, the insurgency in Nigeria, in the Delta region, and other instabilities in the oil-producing areas. So now we're going to have an Africa Command and troops in Africa. So this shows you the militarization of oil is expanding worldwide. Now, the United States is not the only country that is relying on military force. China is following in our footsteps. President Hu Jintao of China has been all over Africa and was there just a week or so ago. He's also building up military ties with African countries, especially Sudan, providing arms to the Sudanese government, which are being used in ways that are hideous, used probably winding their way to the militias that are in Darfur, certainly in the southern part of Sudan. So the United States is not alone. In the pursuit of oil in these unstable areas, U.S. and China and Russia are providing arms and creating an increasingly dangerous, militarized world. Well, let me come to my fifth and final point in this discussion. I want to say to you that the militarization of our oil dependency, of our oil policy, is futile, ineffective, stupid, dangerous, and self-destructive, if I can make all those points. This is true for several reasons. First of all, the conspicuous presence of American troops to protect oil overseas in those places that I described to you, of which 3/4 of them are Muslim or have a large Muslim population. Remember this. The conspicuous presence of American troops to protect oil invites more anti-Americanism, hostility, resentment, and violence than it quells. We think or those who send these troops think that they're going to protect oil. What they do is invite terrorism, sabotage, assassination, and the loss of life of young Americans. I think it's criminal. The most cautionary example, I think, is Saudi Arabia and the rise of Al-Qaeda and 9/11. You have to consider, American officials have always warned, if you look at the historic record, have always warned against the excessive presence of American soldiers, particularly in uniform, in Saudi Arabia, which is, you know, the Islamic Holy Land. It's where Mecca and Medina is, the birthplace of Muhammad, the center of the Islamic faith, because the presence of large numbers of foreign soldiers in Saudi Arabia, first of all, it's seen as a kind of artifact of imperialism by some, but most by devout Muslims as defilement of their holy land, as an insult to their religion, as the worst possible kind of insult. And so American officials and the Saudis they've been in contact say, don't do it. Don't send a lot of Americans here. But President Bush Sr., remember I spoke about his speech to the American public on August 8th, 1990, when he said we have to defend Saudi Arabia. We've been asked to defend Saudi Arabia. Now what he said is we've been asked by Saudi Arabia to come and defend them against the Iraqi troops in Kuwait. But if you read Bob Woodward's book, The Commanders, what you find is that the Saudis didn't invite us. They had to be persuaded to invite us to defend them. They were more afraid, King Fahd at the time was more afraid of the inviting American troops, the large numbers, hundreds of thousands, more afraid of the negative impact of having hundreds of thousands, 500,000 American troops on his territory than he was of the Iraqi presence in Kuwait. So he had to be convinced to invite the American soldiers to defend him. So President Bush had to send his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to Riyadh on August 6th. This is all recounted in the Commanders. It's a fascinating story. And Dick Cheney had to work very, very hard, and he had to produce some satellite photographs showing that there were Iraqi tanks on the Kuwait-Saudi border. And to this day, these have vanished, and there's some question whether they were bona fide or not, but put that aside. And finally, King Fahd said, well, okay, you could station troops here, but only if they're removed the minute that the Iraqis are driven, the Iraqis leave Kuwait and the crisis is over. But then, as you recall this history, President Bush Sr. decided not to invade Baghdad, but to quarantine Iraq, as I said. So they needed the bases in Saudi Arabia to maintain the quarantine of Iraq. And so President Bush had to tell King Fahd, gee, sorry, King, we need to keep our troops and bases there. And that was an unhappy moment. That was the moment when the clock started for 9/11. That was the decisive moment. If you study why 9/11 occurred, that was the moment. That was the moment when Osama bin Laden decided that the royal family had to be overthrown and the Americans had to be driven out of the kingdom, because this was the ultimate betrayal, that the royal family allowed these infidels to stay in the kingdom when they should have been expelled in accordance with the pledge that he made. And from then on, it was just a matter of time. So this is one of the ways in which the use of force, the presence of American troops to protect the flow of oil, is counterproductive. Let me give you another example, equally damaging to the United States. Some of you may have heard this anecdote, but are not aware of its consequences. You might recall that when American troops entered Baghdad for the first time, the American troops protected one building in Baghdad, the oil ministry. You may have heard this story. I think John Kerry used this anecdote in his campaign. But I think what has been lost in the retelling of this anecdote, meanwhile the rest of Baghdad was looted, and the hospitals were looted of all of their equipment, the schools were looted of all their equipment, everything valuable was stolen. But American troops were seen protecting the oil ministry building because that alone was considered important to American authorities. And this anecdote has been retold. That was the moment in which America lost the war in Iraq. Why? Because the Iraqi people saw that that was what mattered to the United States. And nothing the United States has done since then, not the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent and all the speeches given by President Bush and all the people that have been sent over there, have convinced them otherwise that we truly care about their welfare. That story has been told over and over again by the Iraqi people, that that's all we care about is getting their oil. And that's what they believe. So we have paid a very high price for that era of judgment. So, the notion that sending troops to protect oil facilities or to carry out a policy, the militarization, using military force to protect oil is going to benefit us, I believe, is futile and counterproductive. It's also totally ineffective because oil facilities are the most vulnerable, imaginable things to protect. I mean, you could try to protect an embassy, and we know that that's hard to do. You cannot protect a pipeline unless you're willing to have an army of millions. And, it may come to that. you know, there may be a draft. That may be the next step, and God forbid that's what it comes to, because the only way you could protect the pipelines of Iraq is to have a man here, and a man here, and a man here, and a man here, because otherwise saboteurs can, in the dark, can find their way. And we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars protecting the refineries and the pipelines, and Iraq is still producing less oil today than it was and exporting than it was in 2001, because you cannot physically protect those facilities with military means in an affordable, manageable way. And you cannot protect the sea lanes unless you're willing to have a navy of thousands and thousands of destroyers, because somebody with a boat, with a little rowboat, who's a suicide bomber, who's determined enough, can come up alongside one and blow himself up and blow a hole in a tanker, which happened a year or so ago, and sink a tanker or blow a hole in a tanker. So you just can't do it. The Nigerian military is trying to defend the Delta region where most of their oil comes from, and it's utter failure. It can't be done. So it's ineffective. But finally, and you know, my last point, why it's self-destructive and stupid and criminal in my mind, morally criminal and insane, is the road not taken. You know, and I'm saying this now especially to the students in this room. We're going to spend, before the war is over, $1 trillion in Iraq, give or take, $500 billion. No, not give or take. And maybe $2 trillion, some estimates hold, including the interest on because we're borrowing money to pay for it. But $1 trillion is the cost of the war in Iraq. We also spend about $100 billion a year implementing the Carter Doctrine, about a fourth of our defense budget. So over a 10-year period, that's another $1 trillion. So between 2001 and 2010, we'll spend $2 trillion on the militarization of our foreign oil policy, whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea. We may spend in that period, at most, if we're lucky, $100 billion, that's 5% of that, on energy alternatives. At that rate, when oil runs out in 2020 or 2025 or is seriously depleted, there will be no alternatives available. You know, I talked before about, I told you there were no substitutes on the horizon. So the young people in this room, I hope you're hearing me, there will be no energy substitutes available when oil runs out, because we are pissing away this country's treasury on a war, on the military protection of overseas oil, and it will be gone. It will be spent. Instead of being spent on research and development of the energy alternatives that we will need for the next generations to get beyond petroleum. So more than anything else, what's criminal, morally criminal about this policy is the damage that's being done to future generations in terms of the road not taken of investment on the large scale that's necessary to develop cellulosic ethanol, because regular ethanol is a chimera, or hydrogen, or clean coal with carbon sequestration, or whatever it's going to take, so that Young people have a future, an energy future that they can look forward to. So, in conclusion, I say to the young people in the room, you're being robbed by these policies of a decent future. And I hope that you will take appropriate political action to replace the current leaders. And I'm being very clear, they're not just the Bush administration or just Republicans, because it's Democrats and Republicans have been party to this, as I've tried to make clear. So we need a new politics. And seems to me, I'll just give you I'll finish with this. What I think the agenda has to be for this new politics is to renounce the Carter Doctrine. I want the next president to say not one American soldier will ever be asked to risk his or her life, be sent overseas to protect a pipeline or a refinery so that Americans can waste oil in obscenely inefficient motor vehicles. That is stealing someone's life for waste, obscene waste. That's immoral and unpatriotic. That's what the next president should say. Second, we have to extricate ourselves from Iraq as rapidly as possible. And cut the defense budget by 1/4. That's what we spend to implement the Carter Doctrine. That's my estimate. And take that money and spend it entirely on energy alternatives. Now, I don't think anybody could tell you, because I've asked every scientist I could get my hands on, what is the way? What is the answer? We don't know. Nobody knows. Is it hydrogen? Is it biomass? Is it some unyet discovered way of using nuclear energy that does not produce radioactive wastes? Fusion? Is it wind power and solar power? Is it some form of coal that does not produce the damaging effects to the climate? Nobody could tell you for sure which will be the answer. I favor spending huge amounts of money on all of them to find out which one is the right path, or which combination of those are the right path. It's going to take 10 years because you have to go to industrial scale production before you know. Like I say, the Department of Energy is planning a pilot plant for 2012 of cellulosic ethanol, which I happen to think is a very promising idea. But a pilot plant, that could fill up a few cars and trucks, that's not going to get us anywhere. We need an industrial scale plant. There's the integrated gasification combined cycle coal plants that sound very promising, but we don't even have one yet. So all of these have to be tried. I also think that we have to form an energy pact with China. This is the most important thing we have to do in foreign policy. If you look at the statistic, the projections, the U.S. and China combined will be using about half the world's energy in 2030. It's an astounding figure. U.S. and China also, between us, will be producing half of the world's carbon dioxide. The rest of the world doesn't matter. If the Kyoto Protocol, if the U.S. and China are not on board with the Kyoto Protocol and other efforts to control CO2 emissions, we're all going to burn in an earthly hell, because the two of us are going to be increasing our carbon dioxide emissions over the next 25 years by over 50%. So only And as I say, the two of us are also going to be plundering the rest of the world and probably going to war with one another to get what's left of the world's oil. So U.S.-China cooperation in energy alternatives is the single most important foreign policy initiative that we could imagine. So I will conclude then by saying, in my mind, these are the most important things facing the American people in the 21st century. I hope you agree with me. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. Now, I hope some of you will take issue with some of the things I said. Please. Oh, wait, you need to get a microphone so people could hear you.
What do you think about the potential of nuclear power as a possible source to generate electricity and help bridge the gap as we move to other energy alternatives, which we clearly will have to do within the next 20, 30 years?
Well, the scale that is being discussed to make a difference is 1,000 new nuclear reactors, order of magnitude. The amount of wastes, now there is no promise, at present there is no promise that there will be anywhere to put the wastes, because Yucca Mountain may never come online. So that means each of these 1,000 reactors will be a nuclear waste dump. Undoubtedly, some of these will be near populated areas. So there will be a lot of popular resistance. The only way this could happen is if the federal government federalizes the siting of those reactors. The only way, the net result of that will be, I think, I used the term in an article I recently wrote, energy fascism in this country, because the risk, the dangers will be so immense that, you know, the military, you'll have to bring the military and use that to protect these reactors and to suppress dissent. So I think it's a bad idea. I hope you understand that 1,000 reactors, each one of them producing radioactive material that could be stolen by terrorists or become a terrorist target, that will be traveling around the country, and trucks will have to be escorted by caravans through populated areas on interstate highways. Imagine the security, homeland security implications of that. You will need an army. Every citizen who has anything to do with this will have to come under scrutiny. You'll need a separate army to do surveillance of everybody connected with this. I mean, a few more reactors isn't going to make a difference. You need 1,000. And the implications of that are, to me, so horrendous in these terms. Yes, please. And then you, and then I'll look elsewhere. But I see here and here. And, oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
This person and then you.
Two-part question. Could you give us a layperson explanation of the phenomena?
A what person?
A layperson.
Layperson.
Layperson explanation of the geological phenomena of peak oil and how that fits in with the timing of our country's escalation of activity in the Persian Gulf.
Sure. Peak oil is the moment at which the world's oil fields combined, the average of all world oil fields, some of which are rising in production, some of which are declining in production, but the average of all world oil fields reached their maximum sustainable daily production as measured in million barrels per day. It's believed that this moment will come when half of the world's oil has been extracted, more or less. As I indicated, we're at that point now. So I believe we're at the point of peak daily production, more or less. But you can't be absolutely certain. It may be this year, it may be next year, it may be 5 years from now, of conventional liquid petroleum. Two things I have to say about that. What's significant about that in geopolitical terms, I've already explained. That is the what's significant about that is that in any resource, whether it's coal or diamonds or iron or copper ore, you dig the easy stuff first and you leave the hard stuff later. If it's a coal seam, you go after the rich seam first and you leave the bad stuff later. So we have consumed all the easy-to-get oil, and we've left the hard-to-get stuff for last. And the hard-to-get stuff is in unfriendly, dangerous places. Probably the biggest reservoir of untapped oil left in the world is in Iraq. That's where it is, 100 billion barrels. And we have an army there. Maybe there's a connection. And Iran, where we're about to go to war. Those are the two largest places left. Wait, I was going to say more. I mean, my point is not that we... No, my point is, in answer to that gentleman's question, is that I don't mean Iran and Iraq specifically. What's left is in dangerous, hazardous places, the Gulf of Mexico, Alaska, and dangerous militarily and politically. After the peak, everything left after the peak is hazardous or difficult or costly. I can't hear you. Yeah, I just want to say one other thing, because people who talk about peak oil often forget to mention, say, conventional oil, because there's a lot of unconventional oil left. Canadian tar sands, oil that comes from, liquids that come from natural gas, Venezuelan heavy oil that can be refined into a liquid. So more and more in the future, we may be at peak of conventional liquid oil, but there still will be liquids coming from those other sources, so that we will not be aware of it for some time yet. Okay. Yes. Wait for the microphone. Oh, what? Oh, somebody else is doing this. I'm sorry. I will not pick any more hands. I apologize.
You've been tempting us all evening with your analysis of the Iran situation.
Yes.
And just today, the New York Times reported that the IAEA report was released saying that Iran had up to 1,000 nuclear uranium centrifuges and 2 sets of linked
cascades. Yes.
Cascades of 164 centrifuges each
yes.
at the plant in Natanz, which is buried underground and difficult to attack by the air.
Yes.
So I wanted you to sort of explain your analysis on of this topic, since you hinted at it throughout your entire speech.
Let me take a sip of water, if I may. Well, you have two strong-willed people, President George W. Bush and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad has said we're not going to cease the enrichment of uranium, and President George W. Bush has said we're not going to allow the Iranians to acquire nuclear weapons. So we're a bit at an impasse. I think that President Bush and people who have friends who know George W. Bush has told his friends who have told their friends, that's how reliable this is, that he intends not to leave the White House with an Iranian enrichment program underway. I believe that. He has said that, so I believe it. I think the Iranians are not going to back down, so we're at an impasse. Now, there's a lot of talk of diplomacy. Okay. Now, I've been giving lectures to my classes on the expression a casus belli, a Latin expression for meaning the justification for going to war. President Bush has given 3 speeches since January 1st. Well, State of the Union address. He gave a speech on Iraq on January 10th and a press conference last week on Valentine's Day, February 14th. I believe if you listen to them carefully, he has given us a casus belli. He said, first of all, that the Iranians are supplying explosive devices to Shiite guerrillas in Iraq that are being used to kill our troops, and we're not going to let them do that, and we will take action as necessary. As Commander-in-Chief, I'm not going to allow them, the Iranians, to kill our soldiers. That's a casus belli. He said they're building the technology to make nuclear weapons. I'm not going to let them get nuclear weapons. He said they're stirring up, there is a Shiite, a radical Shiite movement developing in the Middle East that's threatening our interests. We have to put a stop to that. That was in his State of the Union address. I'm paraphrasing it. He's creating a framework. I think you could write his speech that he's going to give on, I'll take a wild stab here, May 15th, when he announces to the American people that I've ordered our planes into the air. I'm making a wild guess here, May 15th. This, you could see elements of his speech. What I thought was particularly revealing, did any of you have a chance? Classes were canceled on February 14th at Hampshire, where I was supposed to teach that morning, so I had the rare opportunity to watch his press conference. Did any of you watch his press conference? You had class? Wow. Well, it was pretty severe where I was. Smith held classes, the only school that did. Anyway, I'm sorry to go on about this. If you watched it, 3 times he mentioned the term a Chapter 7 resolution. How many of you know, raise your hand, what a Chapter 7 resolution is? 1. Could you tell us what a Chapter 7 resolution is? What is it? Chapter 7 of what? UN Charter. And say again?
It's a recognition that the international community is responding to a threat to peace.
And what does it lead to?
Action.
Huh? What kind of action?
Political security, theoretically.
Yeah, it is Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which, as Doug said, it says that a threat to the peace has occurred and that the international community is justified in taking extreme measures up to and including military force. President Bush mentioned that 3 times. Now, one reporter asked him, excuse me? What are you referring to? Twice it was wistful. The first time he said, somebody asked him a question about Vladimir Putin. I'm sorry to go on about this. I want you to appreciate the significance of this. He said, somebody asked him, are you troubled about, you once said that Vladimir Putin, you looked in his eyes and you saw a man you could deal with, and now he's doing all, he just had given, Putin had given a speech in which he criticized the U.S. Do you still feel that way? And he said, well, we have our problems. But I wish that Vladimir would join me in sponsoring a Chapter 7 resolution on Iran. Wistful. And then the second time he said, I want to get the EU to join me in calling for a Chapter 7 resolution on Iran. That was the second time. The third time he was asked a question about North Korea, and do you believe in diplomacy? And he said, well, yes, I believe in diplomacy. Diplomacy is a good thing. And another example of that is the Chapter 7 resolution we got on Iran. That was either an outright lie, or I think was more, he was confused, or wishful thinking. The resolution that expired yesterday was a Chapter 6 resolution, because Russia and China in the negotiations said, we will not under any circumstances approve a Chapter 7 resolution on Iran. No way will we approve the use of force on Iran. Never. So today, Condoleezza Rice is quoted as saying, we're going to go back, we're going to meet, we're going to try to get stiffer sanctions. But China and Russia are not going to sign a Chapter 7 resolution on Iran. So I think that President Bush gave it away. I believe this. I'm sorry, because I think in that moment, he gave away his game plan. His game plan is they're going to ask for a Chapter 7 resolution. They're not going to get it. You know, this is what happened in February 2003. They were he was going to go to the UN for a Chapter 7 resolution, and the Europeans and the French and the Chinese said no. That's when the U.S. made a unilateral attack on Iraq, and they pulled out. He is not going to get a Chapter 7 resolution. And I think it was a Freudian slip. And I think what's going to happen is they'll make that effort, and on May 15th, he's going to tell the American people, see, I tried. I had the patience of Job. I've waited 2 years. I've given them 2 years. And they failed me. They backed down those, I'm trying to find a word I could use in public to describe effeminate, cappuccino swilling Europeans, and worse than that, Europeans. They're not willing to go all the way. I cannot allow this threat to proceed. I've ordered American planes into the air. You know, then I could tell you more about the specifics of the military moves that are underway. The aircraft carriers, the minesweepers. He announced last month he's going to double the size of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which I think is preparatory so that there's a larger cushion if Iran tries to disrupt the oil flow from the Persian Gulf. You don't do that. And then, as I said, William Fallon, you don't pick a Navy admiral to command ground troops unless you're planning naval action in the Persian Gulf. I'm sorry I took so long about this. I obviously feel passionate and I'm deeply concerned. Who's doing the picking? This gentleman? So you have to get his attention.
Hi.
I won't take so long, I promise.
You say all these things, and I come to lots of presentations like this and read different things and see different documentaries. What can we do? As normal human beings, what can we do? I mean, we're not really...
Question every candidate for president, Congress, and Senate on their energy policy and their foreign policy, and tell them you're not going to vote for anybody who isn't going to move radically to a post-petroleum, climate change-oriented economy. That's the single most important thing you could do. By the way, I mean, But this is happening all over America now. I mean, this is not a hopeless utopian thing. This is going to be the decisive issue in the 2008 election. I'm certain of it. So the more people who start doing that now, the sooner the leading candidates are going to, adopt, start a draft Al Gore campaign. Rolling Stone came out and with a draft Al Gore campaign, the issue before last, I think it was. Even if you're not serious, the very fact of starting a draft Al Gore campaign will force the others to adopt his politics. But that's what it'll take, because it has to come from national leadership.
I just wanted to ask a question about your alternative energy plan. I was just wondering about the role of conservation. I know that a fair amount of people have come out and said, well, maybe there is no silver bullet. Maybe ethanol won't be the solution. Maybe nothing will really be the solution except really truly reducing our energy consumption. Of course, that would lead to fast lifestyle changes. So I'm wondering where you see the balances between research and development for new energy and cutting back on existing consumption.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry. I had that written down, and I just, in the eagerness to finish so people could ask questions, forgot to say conservation. So I feel guilty. Yes, conservation is crucial. I favor plug-in hybrids, which would be a big step towards conservation. You all know what plug-in hybrids are? Anybody who doesn't? Shake your head if you don't know what a plug-in. Okay, plug-in hybrid. The current hybrid technology it's a gas engine, but you have to run the car on gas to recharge the battery. So you use the battery some of the time, but you have to run it on gasoline to recharge the battery. So a plug-in hybrid, at night you would plug it into an outlet, and you could recharge the battery overnight, and you'd be able to run 75 miles if it recharged overnight. And most Americans drive less than 75 miles a day. So if you had one of those, you'd rarely need gasoline except for a long trip. So right now you can't do that. Why exactly, whether that's a conspiracy or not, I don't know. But that would be pretty marvelous, because then you would almost never need gasoline. I'm also a big fan of public transportation, because that's the best thing. The big problem, though, in America is our land use patterns, because people live too far from their place of work, or where they shop, or where they go to school or church or wherever. So we have to favor land zoning like they have in Portland, Oregon, where the land zoning favors clustering of housing around rail stations and shopping and all that, to encourage people to walk. Walking, that's what I favor.
I'm afraid we have time for only one more question this evening.
Oh, no. Why is that? I want more questions.
Thank you.
Unless we have to abandon this facility. What's that? Do we?
I'm sure that after the event is concluded, people can come up and
Okay. Okay.
First of all, I thank you for your wonderful presentation. During the Q&A session, you hinted at two possible sellout points for Bush government to invade Iran. One is Shiite insurgency.
Wait, could you start again?
See, you pointed out two possible sellout points for American government to invade Iran. One is Shiite insurgency in Iraq, and the second one was nuclear weapons or their nuclear enrichment program. I'm sure Bush is not going to listen to international cries. So is there a domestic technique or method to stop him or like not logically negate his argument of Shiite insurgency or nuclear enrichment for him to like not fully invade, like declare a war on Iran.
Is there a way to discourage Bush from?
Yes. A domestic, I mean.
What's that?
A very domestic, not international, because.
Domestic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to do that, and there are many people in Congress who are opposed, who are favoring legislation, for example, that no money can be spent for this purpose, for example. And legislation has been introduced to ban any funds to be used for any action against Iran without prior congressional approval, for example. I think the domestic basis has to be that the consequences for the United States would be catastrophic, and that it's a crazy idea, that it's insanity. So that's what I try to communicate to people as best that I can. I've written about this in The Nation, and if you go to thenation.com, I have an article called Targeting Tehran, where I lay out this argument, if people are interested.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'd like to have more discussion with you, but I guess I've been told that we're done. Thank you.
Again, thank all of you for attending tonight.
Thank you.
And again, Dr. Klare, on behalf of the Clarke Forum, the Departments of Environmental Science, International Studies, International Business and Management, and Political Science, I'd like to thank you for attending. And we have a plaque.
Oh, thank you.
As a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you. She designed it. Isn't this great?
Thank you.
I don't know if you could see this. It's a rifle for the speedometer with an oil pump over there. It's really brilliant.
Thank you. Everyone have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.